The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard sits quiet under an overcast autumn sky. Docked at Pier 4 is a destroyer escort vessel, the USS Eldridge, a 306-foot warship fresh from construction. What happens next over the course of several minutes will become one of the most controversial military experiments in American history. According to witnesses, the ship doesn't just disappear from radar. It vanishes completely from physical sight, dematerializes into thin air, and reappears hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. When the USS Eldridge rematerializes back in Philadelphia, the crew isn't celebrating a successful experiment. Some sailors are found embedded within the metal structure of the ship itself, their bodies fused with steel bulkheads and deck plates. Others are reported to be on fire, screaming in agony from an invisible flame that no water could extinguish. Several men have simply vanished entirely, never to be seen again. And those who survived are said to have suffered complete mental breakdowns, their minds shattered by whatever they experienced during those missing minutes. For decades, the United States Navy has categorically denied that any such experiment ever took place. Official records show the USS Eldridge was nowhere near Philadelphia on October 28, 1943. The Navy calls it a hoax, a conspiracy theory, an urban legend born from wartime rumors and science fiction novels. But here's the problem with that explanation. There are too many witnesses, too many documents, too many connections to real classified research programs. There are survivor testimonies that match in disturbing detail, despite coming from people who never met each other. There are declassified papers showing the Navy was indeed researching electromagnetic technologies during World War II. And perhaps most compelling of all, there are the unexplained deaths and disappearances of people connected to the alleged experiment. Tonight, we're diving deep into what may be the most successfully covered-up military operation in modern history. We'll examine the evidence that's been hidden, the testimonies that have been dismissed, and the scientific theories that suggest such an experiment wasn't just possible, but inevitable. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories aren't fiction at all. They're just truths that someone desperately wants to keep buried. To understand the Philadelphia experiment, we need to go back to a world at war. By 1943, World War II had been raging for 4 years. Nazi U-boats prowled the Atlantic Ocean, sinking Allied supply ships with devastating efficiency. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its peak, with German submarines destroying vessels faster than the Allies could replace them. American and British naval forces were desperate for any technological advantage that could turn the tide. The United States Navy began exploring radical new technologies, things that seemed like science fiction, but might just save countless lives. One of these research directions involved degaussing, a process of making ships invisible to magnetic mines and torpedoes. By running electrical cables around a ship's hull and generating powerful electromagnetic fields, engineers could theoretically neutralize the vessel's magnetic signature. This wasn't fantasy. Degaussing equipment was already being installed on many naval vessels during the war. But what if you could take this technology further? What if, instead of just masking a ship's magnetic signature, you could make the entire vessel invisible to enemy detection? Not just to magnetic sensors, but to radar, to sonar, perhaps even to the human eye itself. This is where the official story and the conspiracy begin to diverge. According to the Navy, any electromagnetic research conducted during World War II was purely focused on practical degaussing applications. Nothing more, nothing less. But according to those who believe in the Philadelphia experiment, the Navy was pursuing something far more ambitious. They were attempting to achieve total invisibility through the manipulation of electromagnetic fields based on theoretical physics that most people had never heard of. And the man whose theories allegedly made this possible was none other than Albert Einstein. In the years leading up to World War II, Einstein had been working on what he called a unified field theory. This theoretical framework attempted to link electromagnetism and gravity into a single coherent explanation. While Einstein never completed this work to his satisfaction, his preliminary equations suggested something extraordinary. If you could generate an electromagnetic field of sufficient strength and precise configuration, you might be able to bend light around an object. You might even be able to manipulate the fabric of spacetime itself. Now, mainstream physics tells us that Einstein abandoned this line of research because the mathematics didn't work out. But what if that's not entirely true? What if Einstein's work was classified by the military before he could publish it? What if the Navy took those theoretical equations and decided to test them in the real world? Consequences be damned. This is where Dr. Franklin Reno allegedly enters the picture. According to various accounts, Reno was a scientist working for the Navy who had access to Einstein's unpublished work. Reno supposedly believed he could create a practical application of the unified field theory, something that would make ships invisible to enemy detection. The project was given a code name, Project Rainbow, and the test vessel chosen for this radical experiment was the USS Eldridge. Here's what makes this story difficult to dismiss outright. The USS Eldridge was a real ship, commissioned in August 1943, just 2 months before the alleged experiment. The ship's construction and early service record contained some unusual gaps and inconsistencies, and several crew members who served on the Eldridge later came forward with stories that align in disturbing ways. But before we get to those testimonies, we need to understand what supposedly happened that October day. According to the most detailed accounts, the experiment began in the morning. Massive electromagnetic generators were activated, equipment that had been secretly installed throughout the ship. These generators created an electromagnetic field so powerful that it enveloped the entire vessel. At first, nothing seemed to happen beyond the expected electrical humming and the glow of the equipment. Then witnesses on the dock reported seeing a greenish fog beginning to form around the USS Eldridge. The fog grew thicker, more opaque, until the entire ship was obscured from view. And then, according to multiple witnesses, the ship simply vanished. Not just from sight, but from existence in that location entirely. For approximately 15 minutes, the USS Eldridge ceased to exist in Philadelphia. During those 15 minutes, the ship allegedly appeared in Norfolk, Virginia, nearly 200 miles away. Witnesses at the Norfolk Naval Base reported seeing a destroyer escort materialize briefly in the harbor before vanishing again. When the USS Eldridge rematerialized in Philadelphia, the electromagnetic generators were shut down. But the ship that returned was not the same ship that had departed reality minutes before. The crew was in complete chaos. Some men were violently ill, vomiting and disoriented. Others were found in various stages of what can only be described as matter displacement. According to the most horrifying accounts, 5 men were discovered fused with the metal structure of the ship. Their bodies had somehow merged with the steel during the teleportation process, creating grotesque combinations of flesh and metal. These men were still alive, at least initially, screaming in agony before dying from their injuries. Other sailors were reported to be suffering from spontaneous combustion, their bodies on fire with flames that wouldn't extinguish with water. Witnesses described these men running across the deck, engulfed in fire that seemed to burn from within. Several crew members had vanished entirely during the experiment, their whereabouts unknown. They were never found, never accounted for, simply erased from existence. And those who survived physically intact were psychologically destroyed. Men who had been perfectly sane hours before were now catatonic, unable to speak or recognize their own names. Others were babbling incoherently about seeing through time, about dimensions beyond human comprehension. Some survivors later reported experiencing what they called freeze or stuck episodes. They would suddenly become immobile, frozen in place, unable to move or speak. During these episodes, they claimed to be invisible to others, phasing in and out of normal reality. The only way to break someone out of a freeze was to have other crew members physically touch them and focus on bringing them back. This bizarre symptom allegedly plagued many of the survivors for the rest of their lives. Now, if all of this sounds like complete fiction, like something out of a science fiction movie, you're not alone in thinking that. The United States Navy certainly wants you to believe it's fiction. But here's where the story gets complicated, because the Philadelphia experiment didn't enter public consciousness through official channels. It emerged through a series of bizarre letters, witness testimonies, and a book that would change everything. In the mid-1950s, more than a decade after the alleged experiment, a man named Morris K. Jessup received a strange letter. Jessup was an astronomer and author who had written books about UFOs and unconventional physics. The letter was from someone calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende, though he sometimes signed his letters as Carl M. Allen. In this letter, Allende made extraordinary claims. He stated that he had been present at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in October 1943. He claimed to have witnessed the USS Eldridge disappear and reappear. He described the horrific aftermath in vivid, disturbing detail. But Allende didn't just write one letter. He wrote multiple letters over the course of several months, each containing more specific information. He referenced classified research, mentioned scientists by name, and described technical details about the electromagnetic equipment used. Morris Jessup was intrigued, but skeptical, as any reasonable person would be. Then something strange happened. In 1957, Jessup received a summons from the Office of Naval Research. Navy officers wanted to meet with him about a peculiar book they had received. Someone had anonymously mailed the ONR a copy of Jessup's book about UFOs, but this copy was heavily annotated. The margins were filled with handwritten notes, comments, and technical observations written in 3 different colors of ink. These annotations suggested the writers had intimate knowledge of extraterrestrial technology and advanced physics. More disturbingly, some of the annotations referenced the Philadelphia experiment directly. The Office of Naval Research was concerned enough about these annotations that they actually reproduced the annotated version in a limited print run. Why would the Navy go to such trouble over what should have been a crackpot conspiracy theory? Jessup met with Navy officers and discussed the annotated book and the letters from Allende. He left that meeting deeply unsettled, telling friends that he believed something significant had indeed happened in Philadelphia. Less than 2 years later, in 1959, Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. But friends and family insisted Jessup had not been suicidal, that he had been excited about new research projects. Some who knew him believed he had been silenced for getting too close to the truth. Whether or not Jessup's death was suspicious, the story of the Philadelphia experiment might have died with him. But Carlos Allende wasn't finished. Over the following decades, Allende would resurface periodically, giving interviews and writing more letters. His story never significantly changed. He maintained that he had witnessed the experiment from aboard the SS Andrew Fierusev, a merchant marine vessel docked nearby. Allende provided specific details about other witnesses, about the scientists involved, about the aftermath. He described how Navy personnel scrambled to contain the situation, how survivors were quickly transferred and dispersed to prevent them from talking. He claimed that some of the crew members who vanished during the experiment had been killed and their deaths covered up. He even suggested that some of them had been transported through time, not just space. Now, skeptics rightfully point out that Carlos Allende was not a reliable witness. His letters contained grammatical errors, unusual formatting, and sometimes contradictory information. Allende himself had a history of mental health issues and had been hospitalized at various points. In the 1980s, Allende admitted in an interview that he had fabricated some details of the story. But here's the crucial question. Did he fabricate all of it, or just embellish a core truth? Because Carlos Allende wasn't the only person to come forward about the Philadelphia experiment. In 1984, a man named Al Bielek began speaking publicly about his alleged involvement in the experiment. Bielek claimed that his memories of the event had been suppressed through a combination of trauma and deliberate government mind control. According to Bielek, he had been a crew member aboard the USS Eldridge under a different name. He described the experiment in technical detail, discussing the configuration of the electromagnetic generators and the theoretical physics involved. Bielek's account aligned with Allende's story in many respects, but added new dimensions to the narrative. He claimed the Philadelphia experiment was just the beginning of a larger series of experiments. He spoke about something called the Montauk Project, alleged time travel experiments conducted at Camp Hero on Long Island decades later. Bielek suggested that the technology developed during the Philadelphia experiment was never abandoned, but rather continued in secret. Now, Al Bielek's claims are even more outlandish than Allende's, and his credibility has been thoroughly questioned. Critics point out inconsistencies in his story, dubious claims about his background, and a complete lack of verifiable evidence. But again, we're left with a troubling pattern. Multiple individuals, independent of each other, describing similar events in remarkable detail. Then there's the testimony of Edward Dudgeon, a crew member who served aboard the USS Eldridge. In a 2008 interview, Dudgeon categorically denied that any invisibility experiment took place. He stated he was aboard the ship in 1943 and nothing unusual happened. The Navy has pointed to Dudgeon's testimony as definitive proof that the Philadelphia experiment is a myth. But here's what's interesting about Dudgeon's account. He admits that strange electromagnetic experiments were being conducted on ships during that period. He confirms that powerful degaussing equipment was installed and tested. And he acknowledges that he wasn't always privy to everything that happened aboard the vessel, especially classified activities. Several other crew members have given interviews over the years, some denying anything unusual happened, others hinting at strange events they weren't permitted to discuss. The inconsistency of these testimonies doesn't necessarily prove the experiment didn't happen. It might simply reflect the fact that not all crew members were present during the alleged test, or that some were debriefed and sworn to secrecy. We need to talk about the science, because the biggest objection to the Philadelphia experiment is that it's physically impossible. Mainstream physics tells us you can't make a ship invisible and teleport it hundreds of miles using electromagnetic fields. But is that actually true? Or is it just what we're told to believe? Let's start with Einstein's unified field theory, the theoretical framework allegedly used for the experiment. While Einstein never completed his unified field theory, research in this direction didn't stop with him. Modern physicists have continued exploring ways to link electromagnetism and gravity. String theory, for instance, is essentially an attempt to unify all fundamental forces, including electromagnetism and gravity, into a single framework. So the concept of a unified field theory isn't pseudoscience. It's cutting-edge theoretical physics. Now, could such a theory enable invisibility? Surprisingly, the answer is maybe. In 2006, researchers at Duke University successfully demonstrated a working invisibility cloak. This device used metamaterials to bend microwave radiation around an object, rendering it invisible to microwave detection. The technology works by manipulating electromagnetic fields in precise ways to redirect radiation. It's not perfect, and it only works for specific wavelengths, but it proves the fundamental concept is sound. If you can manipulate electromagnetic fields precisely enough, you can make objects invisible to certain types of detection. Scaling this up to make an entire ship invisible to visible light would require significantly more advanced technology. But in principle, it's not impossible, just extraordinarily difficult. What about the teleportation aspect? Here's where things get truly speculative, but also genuinely intriguing. Einstein's equations suggest that extremely powerful electromagnetic fields could theoretically warp spacetime. This is similar to the concept behind wormholes, hypothetical tunnels through spacetime that could connect distant locations. If you could generate a powerful enough field in the right configuration, you might create a localized distortion in spacetime. Whether this would enable physical teleportation is another question entirely, one that current physics can't definitively answer. But researchers in quantum physics have successfully demonstrated quantum teleportation, the transfer of quantum states across distances. This isn't Star Trek-style teleportation of matter, but it shows that the underlying principles of non-local connection exist in nature. So could the Navy have stumbled upon a way to teleport a physical object in 1943? Probably not, if we're being realistic about the state of technology at that time. But could they have achieved something strange and unexpected while experimenting with powerful electromagnetic fields? That's significantly more plausible. Consider this. The Manhattan Project, the secret program to develop atomic weapons, was running simultaneously. The Manhattan Project involved some of the greatest scientific minds of the era working on physics that seemed impossible. They successfully created nuclear weapons that most people thought were pure fantasy. If the government could keep a project at that scale secret and achieve what seemed impossible, why couldn't they do the same with electromagnetic research? There's another scientific angle worth exploring: the effects of powerful electromagnetic fields on human biology. We know that electromagnetic fields can affect the human nervous system and brain function. People exposed to extremely strong electromagnetic fields have reported disorientation, hallucinations, and memory disturbances. This could explain some of the reported effects on the Eldridge crew, even if no actual teleportation occurred. Perhaps the experiment wasn't about invisibility at all, but something went catastrophically wrong with the electromagnetic equipment. Powerful fields could have caused the observed phenomena: the greenish glow, the disorientation of crew members, even the reported freezing episodes. Some researchers have suggested that the experiment might have accidentally created an intense electromagnetic pulse. Such a pulse could have caused severe neurological damage to crew members, explaining the psychological aftermath. It might also have caused electrical fires aboard the ship, which could be misremembered as spontaneous combustion. The reported fusion of bodies with metal is harder to explain through conventional physics. But in the chaos of a military accident, initial reports might have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Bodies severely burned by electrical discharge might have been mistakenly reported as fused with metal. What's undeniable is that the Navy was conducting electromagnetic research during World War II. Declassified documents confirm the existence of degaussing programs and other experimental technologies. The question isn't whether the Navy was experimenting with electromagnetic fields. The question is how far those experiments went and what unexpected results they might have produced. In 1999, the U.S. Navy released a statement attempting to definitively debunk the Philadelphia experiment. The official statement declared that the USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia on October 28, 1943. According to Navy records, the ship was in the Bahamas undergoing sea trials. The Navy provided logs and documentation showing the ship's location. Furthermore, the Navy stated that no research into invisibility or teleportation was ever conducted. They attributed the entire story to a misunderstanding of degaussing technology and wartime rumors. The Office of Naval Research published additional material explaining how conspiracy theories develop and spread. They positioned the Philadelphia experiment as a cautionary tale about believing extraordinary claims without evidence. For many skeptics, this official denial settled the matter completely. If the ship wasn't even in Philadelphia, how could the experiment have happened? But those who believe in a cover-up see the Navy's response very differently. First, they point out that military records from World War II have been altered or destroyed before. The ship has logs showing it was in the Bahamas could have been fabricated or modified to support the denial. Second, if a catastrophic classified experiment did occur, creating a false documentary trail would be standard procedure. The entire point of a cover-up is to make it appear that nothing unusual happened. Third, and perhaps most compelling, the Navy's response doesn't address all the evidence. It doesn't explain the testimony of multiple alleged witnesses. It doesn't account for the annotated book sent to the Office of Naval Research. It doesn't address why they went to the trouble of reproducing that annotated book if the whole thing was nonsense. And it doesn't explain what happened to Morris K. Jessup, or why certain documents remain classified decades later. In 2004, a researcher named Alfred Bielek claimed to have obtained partial documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. These documents, he alleged, showed that a classified program called Project Rainbow did exist. The documents were heavily redacted, with most specific details blacked out. But they appeared to reference electromagnetic research and experimental technologies. When these documents were presented to the Navy, officials stated they couldn't verify their authenticity. They neither confirmed nor denied that Project Rainbow existed. This non-denial denial is typical of responses to classified program inquiries. If a program is still classified, officials can't discuss it even to deny its existence. So the Navy's refusal to provide a clear answer either way leaves the door open to speculation. Another intriguing detail involves personnel records for USS Eldridge crew members. Researchers attempting to track down and interview crew members have found unusual gaps and inconsistencies. Some crew members listed on early rosters seem to have vanished from later records. Transfer orders and discharge papers for certain individuals can't be located or are heavily redacted. For a ship that supposedly had a routine service record, there are a surprising number of administrative anomalies. This could be innocent bureaucratic confusion. Records from World War II are notoriously messy. But it could also suggest that certain crew members were reassigned and their records deliberately obscured. Then there's the matter of the ship itself. The USS Eldridge was decommissioned in 1946, just 3 years after its commissioning. This wasn't unusual for wartime vessels. Many destroyer escorts had short service lives. But the Eldridge was transferred to Greece in 1951 under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. It served in the Greek Navy until 1992 under the name Leon. When researchers approached the Greek Navy asking to examine the ship for any evidence of the experiment, they were denied access. The Greeks stated the ship was still in active service and not available for civilian inspection. After the Leon was finally decommissioned, it was not preserved as a museum ship. Instead, it was sold for scrap and completely dismantled, eliminating any physical evidence that might have existed. Some conspiracy theorists see this as deliberate destruction of evidence. Others point out that most decommissioned warships are scrapped, and there is nothing unusual about the Eldridge's fate. What about the scientists allegedly involved in the experiment? Dr. Franklin Reno, the scientist who supposedly directed the project, is difficult to verify. No mainstream scientific records confirm his existence or his connection to the Navy during World War II. Believers suggest his identity was classified or that Reno was a cover name. Skeptics argue this is proof he's a fictional character invented for the conspiracy theory. However, declassified documents do show that several prominent physicists consulted for the Navy during World War II. Einstein himself had security clearance and advised on various military projects. Nikola Tesla, whose work on electromagnetic technology was groundbreaking, died in January 1943, months before the alleged experiment. But some researchers speculate that Tesla's unpublished papers on electromagnetic fields might have been used by the Navy. After Tesla's death, the FBI seized his papers, and many remain classified to this day. Why would the government still be keeping Tesla's papers secret more than 80 years after his death? Unless those papers contain information about technology that's still considered sensitive. The Philadelphia experiment raises uncomfortable questions about government transparency and accountability. If something catastrophic did happen during a classified experiment, would the government admit it? History suggests they wouldn't, at least not for decades. The U.S. government has a documented history of conducting dangerous experiments on military personnel without proper consent or disclosure. Project MKUltra, the CIA's mind control research program, subjected unknowing subjects to drugs and psychological torture. The Tuskegee syphilis study allowed African American men to suffer without treatment for decades in the name of medical research. Atomic soldiers were deliberately exposed to nuclear radiation during weapons tests to study the effects. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented facts, programs that were once vehemently denied and are now publicly acknowledged. So when the Navy categorically denies the Philadelphia experiment, should we automatically accept that denial? Or should we remember that institutions have lied before and will lie again when it serves their interests? The problem with the Philadelphia experiment is that it exists in an evidentiary gray zone. There's no smoking gun, no undeniable physical proof that the experiment occurred. But there's also no definitive proof that it didn't occur, just official denials and debunking attempts. We're left with testimonies from witnesses of questionable reliability, documents that may or may not be authentic, and scientific theories that suggest something like the experiment might be possible. For believers, the preponderance of circumstantial evidence points to a covered-up disaster. For skeptics, the lack of hard evidence proves the whole thing is an elaborate hoax or misunderstanding. But what if the truth lies somewhere in between? What if the Navy did conduct electromagnetic experiments on the USS Eldridge, experiments that went catastrophically wrong? What if crew members were injured or killed in an accident involving powerful electromagnetic equipment? What if the invisibility and teleportation aspects are exaggerations, but the core tragedy is real? A military accident followed by a cover-up would explain many of the strange elements of the story. It would explain why some crew members report nothing unusual. They weren't present during the classified test. It would explain why others hint at strange events they can't discuss. They were sworn to secrecy or threatened. It would explain the administrative anomalies in crew records, the Navy scrubbing evidence of who was really aboard during the incident. And it would explain the persistent rumors, because the truth has a way of leaking out even when institutions try to suppress it. In recent years, new witnesses have occasionally come forward with information about the Philadelphia experiment. In 2012, a man claiming to be the son of a crew member published a book detailing what his father told him before dying. According to this account, his father had been aboard the Eldridge during an electromagnetic test that went wrong. Several crew members were severely injured by electrical discharge and intense electromagnetic fields. The Navy, desperate to avoid responsibility for the accident, classified the entire incident and separated the survivors. Each survivor was debriefed, threatened with court-martial if they spoke about what happened, and transferred to different assignments. Over time, the story of what actually happened became confused with speculation and embellishment. The invisibility and teleportation aspects might have originated from the visual effects of the electromagnetic field. Intense electromagnetic fields can create optical distortions, glowing effects, and unusual atmospheric phenomena. Witnesses seeing the ship partially obscured by electromagnetic effects might have interpreted this as the ship vanishing. The alleged appearance in Norfolk could have been a case of mistaken identity, another destroyer escort spotted in the harbor at roughly the same time. Through decades of retelling, these elements transformed from unusual but explainable events into the fantastical story we know today. This interpretation allows for the possibility that something significant happened while acknowledging that the most extreme claims are probably exaggerations. But even this moderate interpretation still leaves us with serious questions. If Navy personnel were injured or killed during a classified experiment, don't their families deserve the truth? If dangerous research was being conducted without proper safety protocols, shouldn't there be accountability? And if the technology being tested was as radical as the story suggests, what happened to that research? Because here's the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the Philadelphia experiment wasn't a failure at all? What if it succeeded in demonstrating principles that the military has continued to develop in secret ever since? Modern military technology includes stealth systems that make aircraft nearly invisible to radar. Active camouflage systems are being developed that can render objects nearly invisible to the naked eye. Research into electromagnetic propulsion and field manipulation continues at classified facilities. If the Navy stumbled onto something revolutionary in 1943, even if the initial test was catastrophic, they would never abandon that research. They would classify it at the highest levels, continue development in secret, and deny everything publicly. 70 years later, that technology might be operational in forms we can't even imagine. The Philadelphia experiment might not be about what happened in 1943 at all. It might be about what's happening right now in secret military installations around the world. So what really happened on October 28, 1943? Did the USS Eldridge vanish from Philadelphia and reappear in Norfolk through a radical electromagnetic experiment? Did crew members die horrible deaths, fused with metal and erased from existence? Or is the entire story nothing more than an elaborate myth, born from wartime confusion and perpetuated by attention seekers? The truth is, we may never know for certain. The passage of time has claimed most of the potential witnesses. Any physical evidence has long since been destroyed or remains locked in classified archives. The official narrative from the Navy is clear. Nothing happened. The Philadelphia experiment is fiction. But the questions remain nagging and persistent. Why do multiple independent witnesses describe similar events? Why did the Office of Naval Research take the annotated book seriously enough to reproduce it? Why are certain documents still classified after more than 80 years? Why did people connected to investigating the story die under questionable circumstances? And why does the Navy get so defensive about something they claim never happened? Perhaps the Philadelphia experiment serves as a mirror, reflecting our deepest hopes and fears about technology and government power. We want to believe that breakthrough technologies are possible, that the boundaries of science can be shattered. But we also fear that such technologies might be developed in secret, tested without regard for human safety, and covered up when things go wrong. Whether the Philadelphia experiment happened exactly as described, happened in some modified form, or didn't happen at all, it remains a powerful story. It reminds us to question official narratives, to demand transparency from institutions that operate in secret, and to remember that today's conspiracy theory might be tomorrow's declassified reality. The next time you see a naval vessel in harbor, consider what might be hidden beneath its ordinary exterior. Consider the experiments that might be happening in classified facilities, the technologies being developed that won't be acknowledged for decades. And consider the possibility that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, because the truth is far stranger and more disturbing than any of us want to believe. The USS Eldridge sailed into history on October 28, 1943, and what happened during those few hours remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Was it the greatest military cover-up of all time, or the greatest military myth? That's for you to decide. But whatever you believe, the Philadelphia experiment refuses to disappear. Much like the ship itself, the story vanishes from scrutiny, only to reappear when we least expect it, forever haunting the boundaries between science and impossibility. If you found this investigation compelling, there are dozens of other unexplained military incidents that demand deeper examination. Subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the mysteries that governments don't want you questioning. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking what they're hiding. Because the most dangerous secrets are the ones that hide in plain sight.